Thank you for being here today in a rainy day. This is the first time we are going to talk about elections after the elections, because we have done Brazil, Argentina, India, generally before the elections, sometimes months before the elections, sometimes the week before the elections. This time is the first global political perspective that is the day after the election. So we do know about the results. They are not final, but certainly we know who won and the new, well, we don't know about how the government is going to work out, but we can talk about that. But let me first say that this is an event that Polis, the International House, and the Duke Center for International Global Studies put together every year, twice or three times per year. And this time it's Canada, and this is really to highlight our students from countries that hold the elections and to hear their perspectives and perspectives from their families and friends in Canada in this case. And unfortunately, we were supposed to be here with the Consul General of Canada in Atlanta, the Honorable Nadia Theodore, but she sent a message yesterday that she had to fly to Washington, and we couldn't compete with that. Right? So she had to go, is supposed to the embassy in Washington. They were really sorry about that. They were really nice, and they said that they will make up. So we will organize something else with the Consul General, perhaps about trade, perhaps about other issues related to Canada and foreign policy. She was here last year for a panel that we organized on the new NAFTA, and she's certainly a very, very interesting and articulate speaker. So, as I said, we hope that she will come next time. But we have three wonderful speakers, and let me introduce them. Melinda Melvin is a third-year law student from Canada, studying international and comparative law. She migrated to Canada with her family as a toddler and moved from Mississauga, to Newfoundland, to the UAE, then back to Canada, so to Kingston, Ontario, before coming to Duke. So you experience different weather.
Very different climate.
Ivan Kubezma is a third-year PhD student in the program Literature. His research explores how political comedy thinks through the contradiction of U.S. nationhood and American national identity in the 21st century. So I think that there is some comedy also related to these elections that we may want to talk about. Yeah. And then Eli Levin is a freshman in the Trinity College of Arts and Science. He was born in America but spent most of his life living in downtown Toronto, which is a very exciting, well, downtown Toronto is very exciting. So I'm sure that you will enjoy spending time there. So having said that, what I would like to do at the beginning, I will just go over a couple of slides to frame the elections and the main characters of these elections. If you want to go first, there is this very short video.
From coast to coast to coast, tonight, Canadians rejected division and negativity. They rejected cuts and austerity, and they voted in favor of a progressive agenda and strong action on climate change. You are sending our Liberal team back to work, back to Ottawa, with a clear mandate. We will make life more affordable. We will continue to fight climate change. We will get guns off our streets, and we will keep investing in Canadians. We will champion Canada in all its diversity. We will give voice to the voiceless. And in every decision we make as your government, we will always put this country and its people first.
Thank you. So here we have to compete with Trump about who is going to be first, right? America first or Canada first. So we'll see about that. Anyway, here there are the profiles of the three main challengers. And so Justin Trudeau, we just saw the video, is from the Liberal Party. Andrew Scheer from the Conservative Party. Jeremy Singh, the New Democratic Party. He's a new, not new politician, but he has been the leader of the party just for a few months, I suppose. And then there are, if you go to the next slide, these are what they are called the outsiders. Maxime Bernier, the People's Party of Canada, Yves-François Blanchet for the Bloc Québécois, and Elizabeth May from the Green Party. And then this is for those who don't know much about the electoral system in Canada. It's similar to the UK system, which is important because it explains why, this is for instance the result of yesterday's elections, the party with the largest share of vote did not win the elections. So the Conservative Party got, I think that well, we will see the data more if you go to the next one. Okay, the Liberals secured the most seats. The Conservatives won the popular vote with 34.5%. So this is possible because of the electoral system. And if you go back for, and here there are some data, we can leave it there and for reference. And one thing about yesterday's elections, although Trudeau won, but the party, apart from losing the popular vote, they also lost seats, so they will not be able to have a majority, which is the 170 seats that are necessary to have a majority in Parliament. So he will have to form a coalition. And so having said that, I would like to hear the perspectives from our students, and we can start with Melinda. Would you like to start and say your perspective, your feedback from the elections, and also what you expected?
Yeah.
Thank you. You can speak
Into the
close the
mic.
mic.
Yes. So for me personally, I wasn't that surprised by the outcome. A lot of the advanced polls had been saying that a Liberal minority government was pretty likely. The Conservatives did do better than people were expecting, but they also expected that they would do better because of Andrew Scheer's campaigning over the last few weeks. I think one big takeaway for me watching the results come in last night was that the NDP had a lot of momentum in the last couple weeks, and they didn't really translate that into votes necessarily last night, which was maybe disappointing for a lot of NDP supporters, but still, it wasn't that surprising. You know, when an incumbent wins, it's like, okay, more of the same. But I think that Trudeau will face a few new challenges, being in a minority and having to work probably with NDP and Conservatives on major issues in policy making. So yeah, not too surprised, but also it was interesting to watch a few of the more subtle dynamics play out.
It's certainly different from what was expected a couple of months ago.
Right.
Trudeau was supposed to win science and that's like.
Right.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of things stand out to me. I mean, I think, yes, the election for the most part was as expected. I think when you're talking about the representation and the seats in minority government, this whole kind of conversation is sort of haunted by the specter of the electoral reform that didn't materialize. One of the big points of Trudeau's platform in 2015 was kind of what was that he would in some way, it wasn't clear exactly what he would do, but he promised some kind of change to this first past the post system, which runs into a lot of difficulties in a multi-party system. You know, most of the elected members don't get a majority of the vote. It's based on a plurality. And a lot of people, mostly from the left of the center, who really were calling for a different kind of a system, a more representative system of representation, which would have, I think, made a very different sort of parliament that the Conservatives probably would have had the Prime Minister, but again by a slight minority, sorry. Another point I find interesting was again the kind of shifting terrain of the left of centre in Canada. So in 2011, the election, the NDP, who were the left-leaning party, for the first time were the opposition in government, and I think they were maybe dazzled by visions of power, and so trying to, I guess, take over in 2015, they put forward a very kind of centrist platform that in many ways was even to the right of Trudeau on some issues. And that was a very controversial move in terms of the party. That there had been kind of this trend towards a more moderate position since the 2000s, but this is, I think, was an extreme move. And so the shift towards Jagmeet Singh was accompanied by a more traditional kind of social democratic program, something closer to the roots. While at the same time, the Green Party, which is an environmental primarily party, that's their main focus, they kind of took on the issue of the environment through a social democratic platform. Basically the idea that if you want climate response, we need to respond to other kind of issues. So they ended up, I think, putting forward very similar kind of platforms. So going forward, I think it'll be interesting to see where the NDP falls, how the green kind of environmentalism, if this is the direction they're taking, whether this kind of becomes sort of a unifying banner for people to center of left, or if this is kind of an exception here.
Thank you. Eli?
So, like Evan and Melinda, I was not shocked by the results per se. What really struck me though was the regional divide that's taking place in Canada right now. If you look at a map of the results, now maps of course are not a very good indicator to look at alone because more people live in cities than don't live in cities. But if you look at just a large map, you can kind of see where how the issues people campaign on affects the way the parties won. For example, in British Columbia, in the eastern half of the province, which borders Alberta, probably our most conservative province, it was very, very, very blue, which is for the Americans conservative, because part of the conservative platform was putting a pipeline, which would create a lot of jobs in that area. There was a lot of these sort of, the regional divides and the discrepancies of where people live affects how they vote and how they think was very clear. If you look at Southern Ontario, which is the region I am from, all of Toronto went Liberal, all of the college towns were Liberal or NDP, everywhere else was Conservative. Of course, more people live in those cities and more people live in those college towns, but it's indicative that we kind of exist in echo chambers. Liberals are only talking to liberals, conservatives are only talking to conservatives. Another really striking takeaway that I kind of noticed is the People's Party did very poorly, but the rise of the Bloc Québécois, I would argue the party that did the best this election was the Bloc Québécois, because the Liberals lost seats. They're still in power, but this is not where they wanted to be 2 years ago. The Conservatives thought they had a chance to actually pull away and make a government. They didn't. The NDP lost seats. The Bloc actually gained quite a bit. They gained more seats, and they have, I think they're the third largest party right now, right? Yeah. And which kind of made me think if Maxime Bernier was chosen to be the leader of the Conservative Party at the Conservative Convention instead of Andrew Scheer. For reference, Maxime Bernier is this very right-wing populist figure in Canadian politics. Classifies himself as a classical liberal, but his policies tend to be more extremist. I just sort of think that should he have been the leader, Conservatives would still dominate the regional areas where they did dominate because people exist in echo chambers where they only talk to themselves. And he may have been able to pull away some votes from the Bloc Québécois, in which case we might be talking about a very different election result today. And that to me is fascinating and terrifying because it shows that how the way our elections are designed, the way our systems are designed, is so fragile and so subject to political shocks and political changes. If just 1% or 2% more conservative electors at the convention thought having a Québécois leader of the Conservative Party was important to have, we could be facing someone who makes Trump look like a moderate as the leader of Canada right now.
Well, that is interesting. Based on what you have been reading and also since you are in touch with Canada, what were the main issues that you think influenced the outcome? We heard about gun control, Trudeau didn't say anything about migration, but he said Canada first, or Canada first, so invest in people. So what is your take on this? Is there issues that are not being discussed in general that we know people have been following the elections more closely?
Yeah, it was interesting. I read something a couple of days ago that said that was arguing that this election ended up being about nothing, that there wasn't a key election issue driving people to the poll, or people out to vote, or even discussing like certain issues. I think that some of the biggest issues were climate change, pipelines. I think the Conservatives were really pushing an agenda of affordability, just saying that life for many Canadians has become unaffordable, and we want to limit government in a way that would make it more livable. So Trudeau mentioned a couple of those things in the speech that we watched, but it was interesting that there wasn't a central election issue. This is the way that maybe in 2015 electoral reform was something that a lot of people were talking about and felt strongly about, and all of the leaders were actively speaking about electoral reform, which was completely silent this time around. I don't know if you guys have different takes.
Yeah, I think I would generally agree. I think there's maybe, while there was no central issue, maybe a way in which, like I said, climate issues were central in the way they kind of tie together a lot of different things. So I mean, in terms of climate reform, there's a big Alberta, what do they call it now, the oil sands, and whatever the term of the day. This is a very big part of the sort of Western Canadian economy. I think part of this contributes to the sort of regional divide Eli is talking about, where part of the country really depends on this, and this is where a lot of the jobs in that area come from as well. So there's climate debates also become economic debates and regional debates, and also Indigenous rights debates, because often where the pipelines get built, the government often finds it convenient to trample over Indigenous rights and build through their land. So maybe I would say indirectly climate is perhaps the kind of unifying issue.
Like Evan and Melinda, I agree. There wasn't a central issue, but what was very interesting was each party tried to create their own central issue based on what they felt was important. The Liberals focused a great deal on sort of affordable housing and gun control and immigration. Conservatives focused a lot on economic development, particularly in the oil sands. They focused a lot on farming and the agriculture industries. In fact, I think Andrew Scheer made it very clear that he was a huge supporter of the Canadian Dairy Association, which is like our version of the oil lobby, but with milk. Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, they focused a lot on sort of climate issues and tied it in with the Green Party, but the NDP focused more on using climate as one of many things that need to be changed, while the Green Party said climate is big, and once we improve the climate, here's all the other things that improve with it. So it's just different perspectives on why climate change is important. And yeah, people just found the issues that they thought were important to their party and they assumed would be important to voters, and tried to make those the dominant issue of the campaign.
So let me ask you, was foreign policy related in these elections, so there is not much difference in terms of foreign policy, both vis-a-vis the West, but also towards Europe, Asia, and Latin America?
There was a debate that they planned at the Monk School of Global Affairs, which is at University of Toronto, but they canceled it because Trudeau backed out, and then Scheer was on the fence about attending it. And then what's the point of having the debate if the leaders of the two biggest parties don't really want to go? which kind of, to me, says Canadians don't really care that much about foreign policy when they're deciding who to vote for, because the politicians didn't want to make it something a big art issue of difference. I don't know if you guys have.
Yeah, I would agree. It didn't seem that foreign policy was that like major of an issue to be discussed. I was struck by the People's Party, which is Maxime Bernier's new party. He, I think the immigration piece was quite a large focus of that party, amongst other issues. But yeah, just having that surge in anti-immigrant kind of rhetoric around that aspect of foreign policy was interesting, especially since last election Trudeau had been talking about it, like that was kind of at the crux of refugee migration to Europe, and that was a big issue globally. And Trudeau was saying, you know, we're going to bring in more refugees, which he did do. And so this time around, to have a party on the right kind of bringing up more of this like anti-immigrant rhetoric was slightly surprising to me, actually, because Canadians tend to think of immigration as a very positive thing, as like central to the identity of the country, as being a very, like, with the official multiculturalism policy and that kind of thing. So that was interesting.
It seemed was probably the counter in this case, right? Because he has been supporting migration and integration.
Yeah, I think one thing, so I think there's widespread unease about the NAFTA negotiations in Canada, but no parties really, I think, sure exactly what to do. I think the Conservatives expressed their discontent, but also last I checked said they weren't interested in reopening negotiations. I think NDP and Green were saying they would want to negotiate better things, but it's a tricky issue. I think no party wants to open it up just to make things worse. I think maybe foreign policy, the parties aren't necessarily like super different, and I think it's less a defining issue maybe, because that's why I think immigration was an important point. Compared to American foreign policy, I mean, Canadian foreign policy does not have the same kind of like regional and global ramifications, right? We're not, I don't think, the ones leading anything in terms of where the world's going.
And what about the relationship with Europe, especially with the EU? Was it discussed or just?
No, I didn't hear anything during election time about that agreement with Europe at all. So I don't think it's at the top of people's minds. I do remember last election that many people were talking about the TPP. That was a big issue, especially for NDP and Greens like bashing the Liberal government for, you know, being favorable to that arrangement. This time, yeah, there wasn't. I don't know if you guys heard anything about the European Free Trade Agreement. Yeah, not much.
So there were a lot of talks about scandals in these elections. In fact, part of the reason, according to press, one of the reasons Trudeau did not do as well as expected was because of scandals. What was do you have any comment on that? Is it unusual for Canadian politicians to be involved in scandals, or they're always scandals, as we call it, but this time they really made a difference or had a huge impact on the results?
At least from what I've seen, Canadian scandals are typically more like minor gaffes that were happening. Like before sort of the last, I guess, 8 months, sort of Trudeau's trip to India was seen as a bit of a scandal because he dressed in traditional Indian clothes and said a lot of things that were kind of questionable. And that was really seen as like, oh no, this might affect the election, this might be a huge scandal. And like, it wasn't, because a lot of other much worse stuff happened. I don't know about you, but like this, it's been a rough couple months for Trudeau.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. On the Conservative side, the scandal that Andrew Scheer faced was that he was not licensed as an insurance broker when he worked for 6 months, and compared to other political scandals, it seems a little like benign. But yeah, Trudeau, it is interesting because it was, you know, multiple things over the last few months, especially with the SNC Lavalin whole controversy. To me, that was, I'm from the law school, and so the last 2 years we've talked a lot about rule of law and like constitutional issues in the current government, in the current administration. So to see something like that happening in Canada, I was quite shocked and surprised that it didn't figure more heavily. But I think that he had the incumbent advantage, as well as a lot of people voting strategically who maybe were not happy with you know, the series of events that happened before. But like many people that I know who would classify themselves more as NDP would vote Liberal just strategically to ensure that the Conservative, depending on what riding you're in, to ensure that the Conservatives didn't win, they voted Liberal. So I think that he had those advantages to not lose more seats as a result of the scandals that he faced.
Yeah, I think definitely the SNC Lavalin was, I think the big scandal, which kind of really, I think ruined the sort of Trudeau image of, you know, good government, clean progress, yada yada. What was also interesting was that maybe people heard about the multiple instances of black and brown face that popped up from Trudeau's past. Maybe I do think that hurt him somewhat at the polls, but not terribly. Also, maybe, I mean, that's interesting as a non-scandal as well. The way that didn't like disqualify him. You know, he didn't resign, didn't come at the party, and I think there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, the Conservative Party is not known for its excellent policies in terms of multiculturalism and diversity. So I mean, maybe it's a choice of, you know, of one person's personal failing versus policies that work against diversity initiatives.
Yeah, I think the constituency that would have really drilled into him for the black and brown face maybe would have been the NDP and Green parties, but I'm forgetting exactly, but I think Jagmeet had said something to the effect of kind of not seeing it as a huge issue, even though he did issue a formal statement saying, you know, like me and many of my other, my community that I represent has faced a lot of this kind of like racism but he didn't, I think, capitalize on it the way that I expected him to in weeks after those incidents came out. So yeah.
About a week after a lot of the photographs came out, I actually had a chance to go back to Canada for fall break and kind of ask students who are at U of T and McMaster University what they thought of the issue and sort of how people in general thought about it. And they said everybody cared a ton for 2 days. And then it just went back to politics as usual, which I was very surprised by. I thought it would sort of have much more of a lasting impact, especially around young people who might be more likely to vote NDP or Green and not care about sort of the strategic voting.
So last question then I will. I know, I mean, we read that Obama went to Canada to support Trudeau just a couple of weeks ago. And do you think that played a role, or it's not, it's a non-factor, it was just... and the other thing is connected to this, what about Trump? Because I don't think Trump is very popular in Canada, but perhaps among the conservatives he is. Is there any role that he played in these elections?
I would see Trump's kind of rhetoric not playing out in the Conservative Party as much as in the People's Party. I think that a lot of what Bernier was saying was very much parroting some of the rhetoric that Trump has brought up, but there wasn't a lot of uptake of that rhetoric. So I don't know how much he influenced how much he influenced the election. I think you're right that there is a general distaste towards Trump and the things that he's doing, but I don't think it affected like mainstream politics very much. Yeah.
So the divide. So please, questions for...
Just a very simple question going off the video. So Justin Trudeau said that he would give votes to the voiceless who are the voiceless in Canada, migrants, indigenous, and how easy it is to fulfill this promise?
Okay. I would say that indigenous issues are a lot more prominent in Canada than, for example, they are here in the U.S. Last election, there was a lot of talk. Trudeau made a lot of commitments around like truth and reconciliation and like investigating missing and murdered Indigenous women and that kind of thing. And I think that today a lot of those issues are still, the people who are voiceless are First Nations peoples in Canada. It's disappointing to see, after 4 years, not a lot of progress on those issues, and I think First Nations continue to be disenfranchised in the Canadian political system. But it's a problem that I don't think a single party could fix, even if it was their like flagship issue. And no party would choose to have that as their issue because just because you're not going to get votes that way. So I think Trudeau's critics tend to focus on that. Him advancing pipelines over the last few years has been, many people have framed it as completely adverse to Indigenous people's rights, So I think those are the voiceless. That's what springs up first to me. But what do you guys?
I mean, I think give voice to the voiceless is a nice statement for Trudeau because it sounds great, but it also doesn't really mean anything. I mean, I think in terms of the voiceless, I mean, yes, definitely Indigenous people. I think, I said there's a regional divide. I think in general, Trudeau is not a party of a working class interests. So I mean, any really other traditional kind of issues of power dynamics are maybe what he means by the voiceless. Is he going to do anything to help these people? I don't really think so. I mean, I think Trudeau is, as I said, wonderful on the message. Like there were, I think on Canada Day, it was for the 150th, there were Indigenous protesters on Parliament Hill, so he goes out, he sits with them, shakes their hands, but then turns around and he'll build a pipeline through Indigenous land, so.
The voiceless could also refer to immigrants as there's a very small movement that's gaining a bit of momentum, but not a ton, to actually allow people who have a permanent residency, which is our version of the green card, to vote in local but not federal elections. I don't know if he was referencing that. I doubt he was, but sort of there are a lot of communities in Canada who are dramatically affected by who the Prime Minister is and who don't have a say in who the Prime Minister is. And I think he was just sort of saying a blanket statement, if you feel powerless, I will try to empower you, even though his record has shown that he's spotty on that. Or at least he's tried not to be, but is often spotty.
You talked a little bit about how foreign policy isn't really a divisive issue. I was curious when the Trudeau administration had caused really strained relations with China after the detention of the company executive. I never pronounced the company. I mean, they had even more worse relations with China for a time than the U.S. did. I was curious if that was also not a divisive issue in Canada and whether that had any effect on the election, whether it was something that his government was criticized for because they extradited to the U.S. and whether that was a lasting issue.
I don't know if it was a lasting issue coming into the election, campaign, but I think people generally, like speaking to some people back in Canada about their feelings about it, it's kind of like, well, in many ways, Canada follows the U.S. on a lot of issues, and I think that the tension between U.S. and China, especially pertaining to Huawei, I think people didn't feel that strongly about it. They were like, well, actually, we do agree that there's some questionable stuff going on with this company, and we would support, extradition of this individual. So, Yeah, I don't think it figured heavily, like people didn't feel very strongly about it.
Yeah, I agree. There were some people who were very upset at first. So for the people in the crowd who are from the GTA, there's a very large first-generation Asian immigrant community there, and a lot of the Chinese immigrants to Toronto feel either very strongly in one direction or the other about the CCP. And at the same time, immigrants are less monolithic in Canada than they are here as it pertains to voting. So they're usually already all over the political spectrum. The ones that sort of supported the CCP and were upset with the treatment between Trudeau and, the relationship deteriorating between China and Canada, were already more likely to lean conservative just out of traditionalist views, while those who were critical of China and have a slightly more progressive approach were already more likely to vote liberal. So it sort of factored in a little bit into party identity, but by the time the election came around, people tended not to focus on politics.
So part of what made the 2016 election in the US so almost damaging to our democracy was this hyper-partisan news coverage of both Hillary and Donald Trump scandals. And it's largely considered that like the media organizations really failed the American people in their negative coverage. So I'm curious if you guys, I don't really know anything about Canada's news landscape. Are there these hyper-partisan news channels? Do you think their intensive coverage of these scandals probably had some negative effect on Canadians' faith in democracy? Like, if you guys could just maybe just speak to that, that would be great.
Yeah, I don't feel like there's the same polarization in terms of news coverage. I mean, I think I watched the election yesterday. I think a lot of people do on CBC, which is our national broadcaster. So I mean, they try to aim for some semblance of neutrality. I think certain newspapers or maybe smaller publications do definitely have a very strong partisan slant. I don't think it was anywhere near the same as what it was in the States in terms of the way there were definitely different camps of media definitely fed into that division.
A lot of the news most Canadians get from on the radio or on TV is CBC or CTV, both of which are public broadcasters, so they try and remain as fair. And then those who do read newspapers, a lot of them, the writers and the editorial boards definitely have a partisan slant, but they usually try to avoid reporting on it. So the Toronto Star, well, it will inform the way they report, but they'll try to outright say, this is why you should not vote for this person, or this is why you should vote for this person, barring extenuating circumstances. The National Review leans very conservative, Toronto Star leans very liberal, but most people don't just get their news from the newspaper. A lot of people just listen to CBC.
Yeah, and I think that concept of an echo chamber where you're listening to people who parrot back your own views, while that may exist in like social media and those kinds of venues, I think generally there's less identity politics and there's less clear like I am this way or I come from this place or I care about these issues so I'm going to be this party. I think that Canadians generally weigh like policy platforms every single time to like give a fair shot at all the parties. Although like clearly there will be people who feel that they are part of one party, and you'll have certain ridings where they're clearly a liberal constituency or clearly conservative. But I think that there's less of this kind of trying to feed your own views and have them confirmed by the media, because it's a lot more of an open platform and open debate. I think mostly because it's a multi-party system and the fact that it's not like one against the other and like trying to confirm like your views, but it's more like, okay, there are multiple options. and maybe I always vote for one party because they always suit my views, but there is a lot of like fluid movement across parties, and people tend to get their sources from fairly neutral media outlets.
Maybe since you mentioned political comedy, and that's kind of what I'm interested in. If you compare, there's this new kind of the last couple of years Canadian satirical news publication, TV show called The Beaverton, and there's long-standing stuff like Bizarre 22 Minutes. And if you compare the kind of political humor they do to something like Stephen Colbert or Jon Stewart, it's much less of a kind of partisan view. I mean, they had their idea of like quote unquote good governance as well, but the jokes you kind of get from these Canadian political comedy outlets are more kind of general like malaise or frustration with the political system, or kind of like cynical takes on politics in general. There's not the same kind of slant to it. If you want to read that as kind of a thermometer for the Canadian opinion.
Consider fewer reasons. Other questions? Sorry.
Could you talk about like the campaigns used, tactics used? Like, is it a lot of TV ads? Are they going door to door knocking? What things are happening?
I think there's a lot of door to door, and a lot of like canvassing, getting a lot of people involved. TV ads. I don't really watch TV, so.
There's one. I remember it was a little ad. It was an anti-conservative ad. I don't know if people know about Ontario politics. So recently, the Premier of Ontario, which is where Toronto, Ottawa, a lot of the Canadian population lives, recently elected Doug Ford, who many of you may know Rob Ford, his brother, who's a famous crack smoking mayor of Toronto. He's in a similar kind of vein. So he's kind of gone on a hiatus for the past 5-6 weeks. I'm thinking from conservative federal orders, like don't do anything to rock the boat. And so there's this ad where they had a Doug Ford like person speaking at a podium talking about how he's orchestrating Scheer's policies. So there was this sort of use of the kind of regional issues to kind of say you don't want this at a federal level. I think there's also, the conservatives are big on personal attacks on Trudeau. Was there not as advertised slogan? Was that what they were saying? I think the kind of the scandals around him kind of fed into that, but I guess not enough to change the result.
Especially in cities, there's a lot of door to door because since we're a parliamentary system, my parents didn't vote for Scheer, Trudeau, or Jagmeet. They voted for the leader of their riding, and because in cities it's so dense, leaders can go door to door. But in general, there are kind of TV ads like that where they try and, ironically, they don't always attack the policy as much, even though that's where there's the real difference between the candidates. They try to go at them personally, and as with the not as advertised one, it didn't work as well. In 2015, they tried the same thing with Justin Trudeau. He's just not ready, and then he won a huge majority. Like, the ad hominems don't work as well in Canada. But that doesn't stop people from trying.
I'm curious whether you feel, growing up in Canada, whether parliamentary system works better for representing the views of the people, or comparing it to the United States, whether the more, this or that option, binary option that we give in the U.S., a lot of campaigns, that's a preferable option. What's your perspective?
My personal take is we can question how representative any kind of parliamentary system actually is, and whether this is democratic or not. I think one of the big differences, maybe you get less sort of partisan infighting, but one thing, we don't elect our representatives as much. They're kind of chosen by the party apparatus, and the leaders are kind of elected within the party, and of course they'll kind of be aware of public opinion in choosing this. But it does kind of sometimes mean sort of fringe candidates get pushed out or away, or something like, think of in the States how like Ocasio-Cortez won the Democratic primary there from a grassroots movement, and the Democratic establishment never would have put her in. And there's not a chance for that kind of change in the way the Canadian system is set up. Now, in terms of the direct voting for the leader versus the kind of parliament or the American system, I don't know if one's necessarily better than the other.
Yeah, just picking up on the point about the party apparatus selecting candidates. For example, during this election, the Green Party had issues where Elizabeth May was having to deal with certain candidates in some ridings where actually like their views didn't fully align with everything that the Green Party stood for, and so then having to disqualify candidates and appoint a new candidate in their stead. It is an interesting balance of like being a part of a national party as a candidate versus being really beholden to your constituents because you are supposed to represent their interests, in Ottawa. So it's an interesting system because it seems a lot more bottom up. You're not voting for the top as a Canadian elector. You're voting for your representative, who will then, relay your thoughts to that party. But then it does go the other way as well, where there's vetting of candidates. So yeah, it's difficult to say is one system more representative than the other. I think I would probably agree that a lot of representative systems are not as representative as we would like them to be.
I'm inclined to agree, but in terms of what's more representative, this is actually a very unpopular opinion, but I prefer America's system a bit more, because in America you sort of primary for the ideologies of the people who stand on that side, and then you have the general election where the two dominant ideologies on either side go against each other, be that neoliberalism and neoconservatism, progressivism and right-wing populism, left-wing populism and neoconservatism. Any sort of mix of them is possible based on what people want, and people are not expected to vote party line. In Congress, you can choose to not vote with Nancy Pelosi. You can choose to not vote with Kevin McCarthy. But in Parliament, if you don't vote with your party's leader, you risk being expelled from the party. And then when election time comes around, you're unemployed.
You're less independent. Okay. So just other questions? One question I want to ask you is about Quebec, because of course Quebec independence has been discussed many times. There was a referendum, etc. Is still a big issue, and what is the take both Quebec and from outside Quebec and other states are resenting that?
Just to pick up on what I was just saying about the Green Party expelling candidates based on some of their anti-abortion and other views. One thing was there was a Green Party candidate in Quebec. I am forgetting exactly which riding, but there was a whole conversation going back and forth where Elizabeth May said, no, he's not a sovereignist. He doesn't want Quebec to secede. That's not what he thinks. And then he turned it around and said, actually, I am. There's no way that we can be here in Quebec and not be nationalist. And so then there was a question of whether she was going to, expel him or have somebody else come in or discipline that view. And so it is interesting how the Bloc Québécois swept the province in I think most of the Liberal losses were in Quebec. Is that true? I'm not sure. But I think the Liberal Party lost a lot of their seats that they had from the 2015 election this time around, and they lost to the Bloc Québécois. So I think that there is this sentiment of continuing to desire representation in Ottawa to ensure that Quebec's interests are upheld and not trampled over.
Maybe one point where you see kind of Quebec interest running up against federal questions was in this new secularism law they put through recently. I think it's the government employees or anyone who's going to a federal, or sorry, a government kind of area. Is it just government employees?
I think it's government
Employees. But you can't have any kind of religious clothing or symbols on, which they sell as a kind of a secularism thing, but very much is a sort of a residue of a French nationalist, and it's a coded way of being sort of anti-immigrant, anti-non-white. And this, of course, I mean, if you look at NDP, Jagmeet Singh is a practicing Sikh, and he would not be allowed to wear his turban, right, if he was in Quebec. So leaders were, I think, asked at various points how they would respond to this law. Is this kind of Quebec law? Does this go against kind of federal notions of human rights, and would it be allowed? Would you let it happen in Quebec, but kind of limit how it affects federal things? Basically, how much the federal government should and can kind of interfere when Quebec decides in that respect.
Montreal is a beautiful city. My experience in Quebec has been very nice. I've enjoyed what I've seen. However, culturally, Quebec is very different from the rest of Canada, and I don't mean that in a sort of an ethnic way. I mean that in an actual way day-to-day life functions in Quebec is very different than the rest of Canada. And as a result of that, there's always that Quebec sentiment of we need Quebec interests voiced, which is why every 20, 30 years they have another referendum why they constantly send Bloc Québécois, which is in theory an anti-Canadian party to Canadian Parliament. But that sentiment is not just their way. There's a lot of people in provinces outside of Quebec who feel resentment toward Quebec, in part because of that's the way they act, but also because of just the way resources are dispersed in Canada. They don't have, say, the oil to have a pipeline. A lot of what they do is they take government transfers because they are eligible for them, and then they use those. So people in the West, and by West I mean Alberta and Saskatchewan and Eastern BC, they see Quebec as sort of taking the money that they created and stealing their money. So Quebec as a province, and even as a concept, is very divisive, even among Canadians to this day.
Yes. How frustrating is it that in your lifetime, the Carolina Hurricanes have more Stanley Cups than any Canadian team? Does that really grind your gears?
Is that true? Oh, the Carolina Hurricanes?
Yeah. Go Canucks, by the way.
Since I was born in Boston, I'm a Bruins fan,
You're
so
spoiled.
I'm chilling. Like,
And do you know how did Russia vote in this election?
Don't think
Obviously.
don't think they were paying that close attention compared to the U.S.
So it's 1 o'clock. Actually, we are perfectly on time, Canadian and US time, Eastern. So I would like to say thank you to Belinda, Ivan, AI, and of course Isra and Vijay for organizing this. And I don't know which elections we are going to cover in the spring, but stay tuned. Thank you very much again.